Please. Yeah, both are fine.
Okay.
Yeah. We can have both.
Okay, so first I would like to thank the Venerable Vice Chancellor, Geshe Samden, for inviting me to give this talk this afternoon. And also I have to thank my friend, my old friend, Venerable Professor Sivali, for bringing me to the Tibetan Institute, where he is an esteemed professor, and helping to introduce Pali and the Theravada tradition to this institute. We first met, myself and Venerable Sivali, back in my first year as a monk in 1973, when I spent the Rains retreat at a place in Sri Lanka called Island Hermitage. And Venerable Sivali was there, and he was the one who first sort of introduced me to the routines at the monastery and helped me in many ways. And now we've met just a few days ago after many, many years not seeing each other. Okay, so the talk that I'm going to be giving is on the topic of dependent origination and selflessness. And I think that the integration of these two topics, I know, is extremely important in the Tibetan tradition stemming from the works of Nagarjuna. And what Nagarjuna has done is to bring together dependent origination and selflessness or emptiness into an integral whole, and has used dependent origination as the ground for exposing the truth of selflessness or emptiness. That seems to have been Nagarjuna's sort of unique and original contribution to the development of Buddhist philosophy. I'm most familiar with, of course, with the Nikayas, the Pali Nikayas and the Pali Abhidhamma system. And rather strangely, I don't find in these texts a clear connection between, a clear explicit connection between dependent origination and selflessness. But since the Dhamma is always, all of the facets of the Dhamma are always intricately interwoven, we could say that that connection is implicit in the early teachings, but it took maybe generations even centuries for that connection to be drawn out and made explicit. What's interesting is, excuse me, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, of course, are best known for expounding in great detail, with many intricate details about the teaching of emptiness. But even the Prajnaparamita Sutras don't show what is the ground or underlying principle behind emptiness. What they do is repeat again and again that material form is empty, feeling, perception, the mental formations, consciousness is empty, or all of the Dhammas which are elaborated in the classical Abhidhamma, all of those are said to be empty or to be not different from emptiness. But what is the reason why they are said to be empty? So it was Nagarjuna's contribution is to see that the underlying rationale for emptiness is dependent origination, or pratitya samutpada. In the Pali Suttas, as I said, these two teachings are presented somewhat separately, though there are a few places where they come extremely close together, almost touching. So first I'm going to look at each of these teachings sort of separately, beginning with dependent origination. And since I was just invited to give this talk yesterday afternoon, no, it's nothing to be sorry about, nothing to apologize for. But what I did was to start brainstorming my own brain, and this morning looking through some of the suttas on the internet, and then finding relevant texts, but I didn't have time to sort of organize them into a systematic whole. So this is going to be sort of touching and exploring different bases, which maybe we could use as a starting point for some discussion. Okay, so let me start off. I keep all of my notes on this trip in this little notebook. Okay, I start off with a passage that occurs in the Mahavagga. This is a book in the Vinaya Pitaka, the book of discipline, which gives the story of the Venerable Sariputta's first encounter with the Dhamma. And you know, Venerable Sariputta was the foremost or chief disciple of the Buddha, and he became the disciple who was considered most preeminent in panya or prajna, in wisdom. Earlier, before he met the Buddha, he was like a wandering ascetic with his friend Moggallana, and they traveled all over India looking for a teacher who could show them the way to the deathless. And after all their travels and inquiries, they came back to Magadha, the state of Magadha, disappointed, not having found the teacher. Then, one day, when Sariputta was on his alms round, he saw an ascetic, a monk, walking very, very peacefully from house to house, collecting alms. And he was very impressed by the demeanor, the calm demeanor of that monk. And that monk, his name in Pali is Assaji, and he was one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha. And so he waited till he found the suitable opportunity, and then he approached Assaji, the Venerable Assaji, and said, "Your faculties are very calm, your manner is very tranquil. What is the teaching that you follow, and who is your teacher?" And then the Venerable Assaji said, "My teacher is the ascetic called Gotama, who went forth from the Sakyan clan, and it's his teaching that I profess." Then Sariputta said, "What is his teaching? Tell me." And Assaji said, I've just recently come to his teaching, even though he was already an arhat, but he's very modest. He says, I just recently came to his teaching, and I'm not really well versed in it, and I can't explain it in detail." Then Sariputta said, "I don't need the details. Please tell me the essence of the teaching, even briefly." And then the Venerable Assaji recited a verse, and the verse in translation goes, I think I have the Pali here, "Ye Dhamma hetu pabhava te sung hetung tatagato aha yo cha te sancha nirodo evang vadi mahasamano," which means those dhammas, those phenomena that originate from a cause, the Tathagata, the Buddha, has explained their cause, and also that which is their cessation. That is the doctrine of the great ascetic. And then upon hearing that verse of just 4 lines, Venerable Sariputta reached the first stage of enlightenment, what is called stream entry. So this verse, in a sense, gives us the essence of dependent origination, the essential principle of dependent origination. Not the full elaborate doctrine, but it shows us the essence of dependent origination is that all phenomena originate through causes or conditions, and they depend on those conditions, and with the cessation of those conditions, the phenomena, the dependent phenomena, also cease. And this verse became something, if we call it like the hallmark of the Dharma. So I believe in various languages it's inscribed on monuments throughout India, some in Sanskrit, some in Pali, some in other variant languages. We find that dependent origination is sometimes presented as the discovery that the Buddha, or at that point the Bodhisattva, made on the night of his enlightenment. So when he sat down under the Bodhi tree, after attaining the jhanas and emerging from the jhanas, the meditative absorptions, he begins to investigate. You know, it's not like he knows dependent origination as a fixed doctrine, but he just begins an inquiry, an investigation, starting with the problem that led him into the homeless life. That is the problem of old age and death. So he asks, why is it that we're subject to old age and death? What is the underlying condition for old age and death? Then he comes to the realization that the underlying condition is birth. It's because we're born that we grow old and die. And then he continues this line of inquiry. What is the condition for birth? That's existence. What is the condition for existence? Grasping or clinging, and so forth, until he comes back to avijja, ignorance, as the most fundamental condition for this whole series of terms that defines dependent origination. And then what's interesting, when he discovers ignorance as the most fundamental cause, then there occurs to him, the text says, origination, origination. Thus in me there arose the I, the knowledge, the wisdom, the clear understanding, the light. And then the same comes with the series of cessation, So what is the way to bring old age and death to an end? There has to be an end to birth. And then taking the line of inquiry back, what is the way to put an end to this whole series of conditions that bring suffering? There has to be an end to ignorance. And so with the cessation of ignorance, avijja, the whole series of terms falls down, sort of like a falling row of dominoes. Ignorance ceases, the sankhara cease, all the ways when birth ceases, old age and death ceases. And then the thought occurs to him, cessation, cessation. Again he says, thus in me there arose the eye of vision, there arose knowledge, there arose the wisdom, there arose the clear understanding, there arose light. And so this shows that dependent origination was the discovery that the Buddha made on the night of his enlightenment. It was the discovery that brought his enlightenment. And so we find some other texts which say, I think it's Sariputta who says this, that one who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma, and one who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. Okay, to explain the whole series of dependent origination, the 12-fold series, becomes a very complicated matter, which could take the whole. It would really require a sequence or a set of lectures to cover the whole series. But just very, very briefly, just to show the way it's treated in the Pali tradition. Okay, so I'm just going to go through very, very quickly. And I mean, if you want to learn the details, there are a number of books which explain in much more detail. Okay, so we start with ignorance, which is usually explained in the suttas as not understanding the Four Noble Truths, or not understanding dependent origination itself, not understanding the three marks of impermanence, suffering, non-self. Because of this ignorance, a person engages in various volitional activities that create karma. Then that ignorance and the volitional activities are what drive consciousness into a new existence. So the consciousness here is the first moment of consciousness that begins the new existence, and then the stream of consciousness that persists through the new life. Once consciousness arises in the new life, it always occurs together with what's called nama-rupa, translated literally as name and form, but it means the psychophysical organism that serves as the base or foundation for consciousness. as the psychophysical organism matures, the 6 sense bases emerge: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and begin functioning. Through the functioning of the 6 sense bases, one makes contact with objects, the corresponding objects. Out of that contact, there arises feeling, pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neutral feeling. That feeling serves as the bait or the object of craving. So one craves pleasant feeling, one craves to be free from unpleasant feeling or painful feeling. One develops even a subtle attachment to neutral feeling. Okay, out of craving, when the craving solidifies and intensifies, it becomes clinging. Through that clinging, one engages in a new round of activities, volitional activities, which create the karma capable of fashioning or constructing a new existence. So that is what's meant by bhava, or existence. Okay, then once one has the craving, clinging, and those karmic activities that can create a new existence, this leads to a new birth, and then birth is again followed by or culminates in old age and death. So the way the Pali tradition analyzes or divides these 12 links, and I believe this is also I found this to be also the case in the Madhyamaka Karikas of Nagarjuna, also divides up the 12 links very much the same way as the Pali tradition. So it seems to be part of the shared Buddhist tradition before the division into schools. Okay, so it said that ignorance and volitional activities are ascribed to the previous existence. All of the links from consciousness through existence are assigned to the present existence, and then birth and old age and death are assigned to the future existence. And so when people, especially fairly newcomers to Buddhism, come across this way of dividing dependent origination, they think this doesn't make sense. They think, how could it be that old age and death lie in a future existence, not in this existence? How is it that ignorance existed in the previous existence, not in this existence? Okay, so the way we have to see these 12, the laying out of the 12 links, I call this a expedient or skillful expository device for showing the causal dynamics that lie behind the process of samsara, of birth and death. But the way the Pali commentators explain dependent origination, they say that these 12 links actually fall into 4 groups, and in these 4 groups we have 20 modes. And the way this is done is by saying that whenever there's ignorance and volitional activities, along with them we have craving, clinging, and the karmic activities that create new existence. So we have those 5 factors: ignorance, volitional activities, craving, clinging, and existence. So those are 5 factors that are both the causal factors of the past existence leading into the present, and the causal factors of the present leading into the future. Okay, then when we have the 5 factors: consciousness, name and form, 6 sense bases, contact and feeling. So those are the results, those 5 are the results in the present, those are the results of the past causes, and in the future, those will be the results of the future results of the present causes. And then what about old age, birth and old age and death? Well, it's birth, old age and death are what pertain to the 5 groups: consciousness, name and form, the six sense bases, contact and feeling. So that is really what is born, what grows old, and what dies. And so we have the four groups. First, the causes of the past, ignorance, volitional activities, craving, clinging, and existence. The five results in the present, consciousness through feeling. Then the five causes in the present, craving, clinging, and existence, and along with them, ignorance and the volitional activities. And then the five results in the future, again, consciousness through feeling. And it's those five that include within them birth, old age, and death. So in this way we have these four groups, and each group has five constituents, so we have 20 modes, 20 factors, altogether making up dependent origination. Okay, then another thing about dependent origination. Again, as I said, I've just collected sutta passages that I could find, so I'm not going in a kind of organized linear structure and presentation. So we find that after the Buddha's enlightenment, when he was sitting in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree, after a long period of meditation, sort of absorbing fully the content of his enlightenment, the question rose in his mind, should I try to teach the Dhamma to others? Then he came to this realization. He realized, this Dhamma that I have penetrated is very deep, difficult to see, difficult to understand. It's subtle, sublime, to be penetrated by the wise. But these ordinary people are foolish, given to lust and hatred. They won't be able to see. He says that there are two things that they won't be able to see. One of them is dependent origination, and the other is nibbana, which is liberation from dependent origination. So this shows, actually, the way I understand it, that this was pretty much the content of the Buddha's enlightenment, the two basic principles that he realized through his enlightenment. One is dependent origination, and then by tracing the chain of conditions back to ignorance and breaking through ignorance, all of the factors, the causal factors, come to an end, and then he attains nibbana. And so those were the two things that he was hesitant to teach, because he was afraid that people would not be able to understand them. But then it happened, as we know, that Brahma Sahampati, one of the high deities, comes down from the Brahma world and appears before the Buddha and pleads with him and says, please, Bhante, there are people with little dust in their eyes who would be able to understand the Dhamma. Please go forth and teach the Dhamma. There are those who will be able to understand. Then the Buddha again looks out at the world with his Buddha vision and sees that beings are like lotus flowers in the lake. Some are just buried deep in the mud, unable to understand. Some are like lotus flowers that are rising through the water. And some are like lotuses that are just on the surface of the water, and they need only the sunlight to open up. And then the Buddha decides to teach. Okay, so we find also some interesting things said in the suttas about dependent origination. And one of them actually goes closely with a verse in the Madhyamaka Karikas, where Nagarjuna says, that which we call emptiness, dependent origination, the middle way, and it's fire. Wait, it's upadaya panyati. That would be the Pali. Upadaya prajnapti. How would you translate this? dependent description. Okay, so anyway, Nagarjuna is identifying emptiness, dependent origination, and the middle way in that verse. Okay, we find a base for this even in the Pali Nikayas, except here the Buddha doesn't call dependent origination, not the middle way, because the middle way, Majjhima Patipada, is the way of practice. And that's what the Buddha calls the Noble Eightfold Path, is the Majjhima Patipada, the middle way of practice. It's the way that avoids the extremes of sensual indulgence and the extreme of self-mortification. But rather what the Buddha says when he teaches dependent origination, he says, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma in the middle. He says, Majjena Dhammam Deseti. So against, even though it's not the middle way, but it's the Dhamma taught in the middle. And the reason it's said to be the Dhamma taught in the middle is because dependent origination avoids the two extremes in which all of the views, the philosophical views that were in circulation in India during that period, and probably even up to the present, all of them fall into these two extremes. The two extremes are eternalism, which posits some kind of eternally existing entity within the person or out in the world. Well, in other words, the view that there is like an eternal self or an eternal deity that remains ever the same without change. And the other extreme is the extreme of annihilationism, the extreme that holds that the person exists temporarily between birth and death, and with the event of death, everything comes to an end, everything vanishes. So what dependent origination teaches is that all of these phenomena that constitute sentient existence arise dependently, dependent on causes and conditions, and when those causes and conditions cease, then the dependent phenomena ceases. And there's a sutta, and I think this is one of the few early suttas that Nagarjuna actually quotes in the Madhyamaka Karika. In the Pali version, it's called the Kachana Gota Sutta. It's Samyutta Nikaya, it's chapter 12, sutta number 15. Yeah, in this sutta, a monk named Kachana Gota comes to the Buddha and says, right view is spoken about. So we always speak about samaditi, right view. How does one hold right view? And then the Buddha says, the world, for the most part, depends upon two extremes. Or the world depends upon dvaya, depends upon a duality, a dyad. So one of these extremes is the extreme of the idea of existence. And the other extreme is that of non-existence. And then the Buddha says that the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle way. And then he goes on to say that for one who sees the origination of the world as it really is, there is no holding to the view of non-existence in regard to the world. Because when you see the origination of the world through dependent origination, one realizes that as long as ignorance and craving have not been eradicated, there's always going to be a renewal of existence. And with the renewal of existence, of becoming, a world will become manifest and will be immersed in the experience of the world. So as long as one has not seen, when one sees the origination of the world as it really is, then there is no view of non-existence in regard to the world. That is, one can't hold to the view of annihilation, because one sees that these causes and conditions, ignorance, craving and clinging, are what regenerate, what produce again and again the cycle of existence. And then he says on the other side, when one sees the cessation of the world as it really is, then one is unable to hold to the view of existence in regard to the world. That is, when one sees the cessation of all of the phenomena that constitute our body and mind, then one is unable to hold to the idea of some kind of permanent self or some kind of permanent deity, created deity in regard to the world. Okay, so this is how the Buddha shows or explains that dependent origination as the middle teaching, which avoids the extreme. Here he says it avoids the extreme of existence and non-existence. There are some other suttas, again in the same chapter, where the Buddha says that dependent origination is the middle doctrine because it avoids the extremes of eternalism and annihilationism, the extreme of unity and or oneness of everything, and the extreme of diversity, of pluralism, that there's an ultimate diversity amongst things. The Buddha also presents dependent origination. It's an interesting set of suttas where he says, I will teach you the origin and passing away of the world. And then he says, what is the origin of the world? So he starts off with the I and form. So independent on the I and forms, there arises I consciousness, visual consciousness. The coming together of consciousness with the object through the I, that is contact. With contact as condition, there's feeling. With feeling as condition, there's craving, clinging, and so forth through birth, old age, and death. That is the origination of the world. So this shows, in a way, like the Buddhist perspective on the world. Usually we think that there's an objective world existing out here, and that we are just sort of chance people who have somehow sprung up within this objectively existing world. But in the Buddha's presentation of dependent origination, the world exists because we, situated in the world, through our 6 sense bases, make contact with the 6 corresponding objects. And that contact generates feeling, craving, and clinging, and that projects consciousness into a new existence which brings forth a world present to consciousness. Okay, so these are just some aspects of dependent origination in the early teachings. Okay, now I'll turn to the other side of my talk, and that is the teaching on selflessness or non-self. And probably the most basic text for the teaching of non-self is one that was first taught right here in this, well, near the city of Sanat in the Deer Park, which was the second formal discourse of the Buddha, the discourse on non-self, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. In that discourse, the Buddha lays down, there are two arguments, 2 separate arguments for the principle of anatta, non-self. So the first argument, it proceeds in the form of a question and answer dialogue between the Buddha and the first 5 monks. So he asks, or he says that this body, this physical form, leads to affliction, that we don't have control over this physical form, so that we could say, let my form be thus. Say, I want to be always young, healthy, to be alive, not to die. I want to be beautiful, successful, and so on. So I don't have that mastery or control over form. And so then the Buddha says, because form, physical form, leads to affliction, therefore physical form is not self. And then the same argument is presented with regard to the other 4 aggregates. Feeling, I can't always feel, the extreme, blissful, pleasant feeling, but inevitably I undergo painful and miserable feelings. Perception, I can't, the aggregate of perception, I can't always perceive everything that I want to see. I want to see a perfectly clean city of Varanasi. No garbage on the ground, no vehicles spewing out gas exhaust. But I don't get to see that because I can't control my perception. The volitional activities, again, I don't have mastery over them. I have some degree of control, but not absolute mastery. And consciousness, the fifth aggregate. We don't have mastery over them so that I can determine just by an act of will that my feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness accord with my desire. And so that lack of absolute control, lack of mastery, shows that the five aggregates are not self. Because what's implicit here is the idea that if something is the self or something belongs to the self, we should be able to control it absolutely through our act of will. And so what I can't control, that is held to be non-self. It would be interesting to do an inquiry, and I haven't been able to do this, into what would be maybe the Vedic or Upanishadic underpinnings of this conception of the self, the connection of the idea of self with that of mastery or control. Okay, the second argument that we find in the discourse on non-self is in terms of the three characteristics. So the Buddha begins by questioning amongst what do you think is bodily form, permanent or impermanent? Then the answer, it's impermanent. Is what is impermanent pleasant or pleasurable or painful? Sukha or dukkha? It's dukkha. It's unsatisfactory, deficient, defective. Then the Buddha says, is what is impermanent, and is it fitting to take what is impermanent, subject to suffering, subject to change, to take that to be oneself? And then the answer comes, no, it's not fitting. And so the Buddha says, therefore, whatever physical form there is, whatever feeling, perception, whatever volitional activities, whatever consciousness there is, all of that should be seen as it really is, with samapanyaya, with correct wisdom. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. And then from this, the Buddha continues, therefore, seeing in such a way, seeing these five aggregates as not self, the instructed or learned noble disciple becomes disillusioned or disenchanted with form, feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness. Through that disenchantment, he becomes dispassionate towards them. Viraga sets in. And then through viraga comes vimutti, liberation. Okay, so those are the two basic arguments for non-self. One is the argument from the fact that the five aggregates are subject to affliction, that we don't have absolute control over them. The second argument proceeds from impermanence to dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, to the selfless nature of the five aggregates. Yeah, there is an interesting sutta with similes for the five aggregates, which show the correlation or connection between the, I call it the classical teaching or the archaic teaching of non-self and the teaching on emptiness that's going to emerge in Buddhism. And this is in this Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, it's sutta number 95. The name of the sutta is the lump of foam. Yeah. In this sutta, the Buddha, together with the monks, they're staying on the banks of the river Ganges. And then as they're sitting there, a lump of foam comes drifting down the river. And then the Buddha points to the monks, he points out that lump of foam. He says, do you see that lump of foam? And the monks say, yes. And then he says, that lump of foam, when we look at it from a distance, it looks so solid and substantial. You know, it looks like a big mass of stone is coming down the river. But if you come close to that lump of foam, and you take a stick and you hit it, you see that it's just foam which will collapse. So when you examine it close up, it appears to be empty, to be hollow, to be insubstantial or coreless, asaraka, without any sara, without any inner core. And so the Buddha says, in the same way, this material form, which seems to be so solid and substantial, when you look at it with wisdom, you see that it's hollow, empty, coreless, insubstantial. And I find that to be quite interesting when we compare the Buddha's statement so many 2,500 years ago with what modern physics tells us about the constitution of matter. You know, this table seems to be so hard and solid. If I try to put my hand through it, I meet with this resistance. But if we have like a super microscope and we look at it, we see it's made up of molecules. Those molecules are made up of atoms. And we look into the atoms and we see that maybe the nucleus is like a football in the middle of a football field. The electrons are like a few spectators in the stands. And the rest is just empty space. Okay, so that's with regard to physical, to matter, material form. In regard to feeling, the Buddha uses the example of, in the rainy season, there'll be a pool of water, and then it's raining heavily, and on the surface of the water, bubbles appear. And each bubble, when it pops up, it appears like a sphere of crystal. But as soon as the bubble pops up, it immediately bursts, and we see that all along the bubble is empty. And so the Buddha says, in the same way, feelings, like when you're feeling pleasure, you're feeling pain, it seems to be something enduring, something substantial. But when you look closely into feeling and sees that feeling is just a momentary event, each feeling occurs in a split second and then it's gone. It bursts like the bubble. And then perception, the Buddha uses the example of a mirage that appears in the summertime. I update this to modern times when we're driving during a hot, sunny day along a road. Often we see what looks like a pool of water on the road ahead of us. When I was a kid driving with my parents, riding the car with my parents, when I used to see that, I thought, uh-oh, we're heading into a pool of water. But when we arrive at that spot, there's no water there. It's just an illusion created by, I guess, the refraction of the light. So the Buddha says, in the same way, perception is a mirage. We see things as being real, solid, substantial, existing in their own right. But when you examine them with wisdom, we see how perception is deceiving us. Okay, then for the volitional activities, the sankharas, the Buddha uses the example of a man who wants to build something with hardwood, solid wood, and he goes into the woods and he sees a banana tree. It's a big, strong-looking banana tree. So he thinks, I can get some hardwood from that banana tree. So he cuts it down at the root, and then he thinks, I'll peel it, and then by peeling off these layers, finally I'll get to the hardwood. But he peels one layer, another layer, another layer. Finally, when he peels the last layer, there's nothing left. It's just these layers wrapped one around the other. And so the volitional activities are in the same way, just a whole bundle of different volitional formations, but there's nothing solid within them. And then consciousness is like, the Buddha compares it to a magical illusion. It's like a magician. They say that the Indian magicians were able to do this. I don't know if it's true or not. A magician at the crossroads takes some sticks and grass and little pebbles, puts them out on his table, waves a wand with a cloth in front of it, recites some mantra, then pulls the cloth away, and there's a bunny rabbit. And so you're looking at that magical display and you're thinking, wow, that's amazing, that's incredible. All of the laws of physics now are just thrown out the window. But if we have a viewer sort of standing behind the curtain there watching what the magician is doing, he's seeing the magician as he puts that cloth in front of the that stack of grass and sticks. He's reaching with the other hand into his drawer, pulls out a bunny rabbit, puts it there very quickly, and then pulls the cloth away, and everybody is awestruck. Okay, so that is consciousness is like a magical illusion. It shows us sort of a real substantial world there, but when we look into the nature of consciousness, we see that there's, in fact, the consciousness is what seems to be like the final, let's say the final determinant for the notion of myself. You know, we could say, okay, the body is not self, feeling, perception, the volitional activity is not self, but especially within the strain of Vedantic thought, it's the chit, sat chit, ananda, the chit, which is taken to be the Atman, the self. But for the Buddha, vijnana is just a process that's arising and passing away, wrongly grasped as being the self. Okay, I brought in a few things on sunyata, but I don't know how I'm doing for time. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll just touch some briefly on sunyata, then I wanted to leave some time for questions and discussion. Well, sometimes there's an idea that sunyata was somehow an idea completely original to the Prajnaparamita Sutras and then developed philosophically by Nagarjuna. But one can find at least the roots, or at least the seeds of the idea of shunyata already in the early suttas. And I looked for several suttas that bring forth this idea of sunyata. One is in the Samyutta Nikaya again. This is in chapter 35, it's sutta number 85. In this sutta, the Venerable Ananda comes to the Buddha and says that, I've heard you say that the world is empty. The world is empty. In what sense is the world empty? And then the Buddha says, the I, that's the visible I, or this I, not the I is the self. Yeah, the visual organ. The I is empty of a self or anything that belongs to the self. Visible forms are empty of the self or anything belonging to the self. The ear, nose, tongue, body, mind is empty of the self or of anything that belongs to a self. And then there are objects, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental objects are empty of a self or of anything that belongs to a self. So we see here, like this is a source out of which the idea of sunyata could have developed. And then there's a beautiful chapter in a work called the Sutta Nipata. The chapter is called the Parayana, the way to the far shore, to the further shore. And one of the, in that work, the Parayana, there are 16 Brahmins who have heard the reputation of the Buddha, and they travel all the ways from the area that now I think would correspond to Telangana, all the ways up to Savatthi, and then they go on to Rajagaha to see the Buddha, to meet him. And they each have a set of questions that they urgently want to ask the Buddha. And one of these Brahmins is named Mogaraja, and he asked the Buddha, how should one look upon the world so that the king of death does not see one? And then the Buddha replies, look upon the world as empty. Uproot the wrong view of self. If you look upon the world in such a way, the king of death will not see you. And so here, in this very important and very beautiful text, we have the Buddha recommending looking upon the world as empty, as the way to destroy the wrong view of self and thereby escape the bondage of old age and death. Okay, maybe this will do sort of like a basic presentation, and then we could have some time for questions, discussions.
And
Yeah.
and my question is about the out of 12 interdependent
Links, yeah.
origination. The first one, ignorance, we usually